The border town of Venlo lay quiet beneath a low autumn sky. Fog clung to the riverbanks, dulling sound and distance, while the smell of wet leaves and cold metal drifted through empty streets. Cafe windows glowed dimly behind drawn curtains. Engines idled briefly, then went silent. Nothing about the evening suggested danger, yet everything about it carried tension. Europe was already at war, but not yet fully aflame. Britain and Germany watched each other across borders that felt temporary, fragile. Intelligence moved faster than armies. Meetings were arranged in neutral spaces, hotels, cafes, quiet towns like this one. Here, secrecy mattered more than flags or uniforms. On this night, British intelligence officers believed they were close to something valuable. But they had come to meet a supposed group of German anti-Nazi conspirators, men who claimed to oppose Hitler from within his own system. The promise was intoxicating: insider access, disillusioned officers, a shortcut into the heart of the enemy. The setting seemed deliberately ordinary: a road near the border, a parked car, the soft crunch of boots on damp ground, the sound of a clock ticking somewhere inside a nearby building. Cigarette smoke curled briefly in the cold air, then vanished. Conversations were meant to be brief, controlled, and professional. What the British did not know was that they were already inside a trap. The meeting near Venlo in November 1939 was a carefully planned German counterintelligence operation. The stage had been set long before the first car arrived. Across the border, German security services waited. And uniforms were concealed beneath coats. Weapons were ready but unseen. Orders had been rehearsed. The goal was not negotiation, but capture. Silence mattered more than speed. Surprise mattered more than force. This was not an ambush born of chance. It was the result of months of deception, false identities, and patient manipulation. The operation was designed by the British, who had studied, anticipated, and exploited. Before a single shot was fired, before alarms or pursuit, Britain's intelligence network stood at the edge of collapse, unaware that one quiet roadside meeting was about to cripple years of clandestine work. How could Britain's intelligence services, experienced and cautious after years of continental espionage, walk so calmly into danger? Yeah, that question would echo through intelligence circles long after the events at Venlo. But on that autumn night in 1939, it remained unasked. Confidence filled the space where doubt should have been. British intelligence believed it had cultivated a rare opportunity. Contacts claiming to represent disaffected German officers had made careful approaches, offering insight into internal opposition to Hitler. The tone was restrained, the information plausible, the risks calculated. British intelligence officers believed they were dealing with genuine members of an anti-Hitler resistance inside Germany. Such prospects were scarce and valuable, especially so early in the war. Neutral ground was essential. The Netherlands, not yet invaded, offered a convenient buffer. In border towns like Venlo were used frequently for discreet meetings, close enough for access, distant enough for deniability. The setting itself created an illusion of safety. Diplomacy and espionage had long shared such spaces, and routine bred trust. Yet questions lingered beneath the surface. Why did these German contacts seem so eager? Why were meetings pressed forward despite the risks of border proximity? Intelligence tradecraft demanded skepticism, but urgency has a way of dulling it. Information, once believed to be rare, becomes difficult to question. German counterintelligence understood this weakness well. The Sicherheitsdienst specialized in counter-espionage operations designed to identify and neutralize foreign intelligence networks. They studied not only procedures, but psychology, and they knew how the desire for access could override caution. The mystery deepens when considering preparation. British officers did not arrive recklessly. Precautions were taken. Cover stories were arranged. Escape routes considered. Yet none of these measures addressed the core assumption that the contacts themselves were genuine. Once that belief was held, everything else followed naturally. Civilians nearby sensed nothing unusual. Locals went about their routines, unaware that intelligence services from two hostile powers were converging quietly near their homes. The smell of bread from early ovens mixed with damp air. Bicycles passed along narrow streets. Ordinary life provided cover for extraordinary risk. Why did no alarm sound earlier? Why did no single detail break the illusion? The answer lies in how intelligence failures often occur, not through ignorance, but through misplaced confidence. The information being offered fits expectations. It confirmed what Britain hoped was true, that resistance existed within Germany. The mystery of Venlo is not simply who betrayed whom, it is how professionalism, caution, and experience were undone by belief. The trap did not rely on force alone, it relied on anticipation, on understanding what the enemy wanted to believe and feeding it carefully until doubt no longer felt necessary. Venlo sat quietly along the Dutch-German border, a town shaped by transit rather than destination. Roads converged, rail lines passed through, and the river moved steadily past warehouses and modest homes. In late 1939, the air smelled of damp earth and coal smoke, and fog often settled early, softening outlines and dulling sound. Neutrality had given the town a fragile calm. The Netherlands was still officially neutral, and that status defined daily life. Before May 1940, the Netherlands was not yet occupied by Germany and served as a meeting ground for foreign intelligence services. Civilians went to work as usual. Shops opened at regular hours. Border traffic continued under watchful but routine controls. The war felt close, but not yet present. Among the locals were shopkeepers, porters, cafe owners, people accustomed to strangers who asked few questions and stayed briefly. One such civilian worked near the border crossing, responsible for routine tasks that placed him close to passing vehicles and unfamiliar faces. His job required attention to timing, license plates, and movement, and not for security, but for order. Routine sharpened his senses. He noticed cars that arrived and left without purpose, men who waited rather than entered buildings, conversations that stopped abruptly when footsteps approached. None of this suggests violence. It suggested coordination. In a border town, coordination stood out. The buildings themselves encouraged discretion. Narrow streets echoed easily. Windows reflected movement at night. A single car engine could be heard blocks away. Fog carried sound unpredictably, amplifying some noises while swallowing others. People learned to listen without appearing to. The civilian did not know the names of intelligence services or the stakes involved. He did not see uniforms or weapons. What he noticed were patterns, meetings arranged too carefully, arrivals timed too precisely, or glances exchanged instead of words. These were the kinds of details locals noticed because they had to live with them. Cafes played their usual role as neutral spaces. Tables were wiped clean, coffee served without comment, conversations kept low. Cigarette smoke hung under dim lights. Outsiders blended in easily, provided they behaved like everyone else. Those who behaved too carefully drew quiet attention. British intelligence officers routinely used civilian locations in neutral countries for clandestine meetings. Venlo fit that pattern perfectly. It offered access without commitment, proximity without visibility. For intelligence work, it was convenient. For counterintelligence, it was ideal. The civilian sensed unease without understanding why. He did not intervene. He did not report anything unusual. In neutral territory, discretion was survival. Yet his observations formed part of the environment in which the trap closed, an environment that looked ordinary, felt calm, and concealed a convergence of forces about to collide. The location itself played a silent role. Venlo did not create the incident, but it enabled it. Neutral ground, familiar routines, and civilians who noticed but did not act, All of it formed the backdrop against which Britain's intelligence network would soon suffer one of its most damaging early blows. The first warning signs did not appear dramatic. They surfaced as small irregularities in behavior that, taken alone, seemed harmless. Meetings were requested with unusual urgency. Locations were changed at short notice, always explained by vague concerns about security. Timing became precise, too precise, arrivals measured to the minute, departures equally controlled. Intelligence officers noticed, but did not yet doubt. British agents involved in the meetings followed established tradecraft. They varied routes, checked reflections in windows, and listened for footsteps behind them. Yet the environment felt calm. No one followed too closely. No signals appeared out of place. The absence of threat itself became reassuring. Familiarity dulled suspicion. Across the border, German counterintelligence watched patiently. The Sicherheitsdienst had already identified British intelligence activity in the region and monitored it closely. Their approach was deliberately restrained. No visible tail, no early intervention. The goal was confirmation, not disruption. All local civilians sensed something unusual only in fragments. Cars idled too long near quiet roads. Men stood apart from one another, exchanging glances instead of words. The smell of engine oil lingered where vehicles should have passed quickly. These details were unremarkable unless repeated, and repetition was easy to miss. British officers believed their German contacts were cautious allies. The contacts spoke carefully, avoided ideological declarations, and focused on practical matters. They offered information that appeared valuable, but not sensational, just enough to build trust. German agents posing as anti-Nazi conspirators deliberately fed British intelligence-controlled, believable information. Each exchange deepened confidence. The border itself introduced subtle danger. Roads narrowed. Our patrols increased quietly on the German side. Uniformed figures were glimpsed briefly, then lost in the fog. These sightings were dismissed as routine border security. Neutral territory created a false sense of insulation, as if danger could not cross invisibly. Inside cafes and rented rooms, conversations stayed brief. Maps were unfolded, then folded again quickly. Notes were memorized rather than written. The smell of stale coffee and tobacco clung to small spaces. Intelligence work looked ordinary, almost administrative. That ordinariness concealed risk. German planners noted every habit: arrival times, vehicle types, who exited first, who watched the surroundings. The SD studied British operational patterns to determine command structure and personnel. Each meeting added clarity. Each successful contact confirmed British confidence and German readiness. No single moment demanded retreat. No alarm forced reassessment. Instead, suspicion was slowly neutralized by routine success. Meetings occurred without incident. Trust grew. The British believed they were managing risk carefully, unaware that their caution itself had been anticipated. By the time the suspicious activities felt familiar rather than noteworthy, the trap was already complete. The danger had never been in what was seen. It lay in what was assumed, that the meeting itself was real, that neutrality offered safety, and that patience belonged only to one side. As meetings continued, British intelligence began assembling a picture that felt increasingly coherent. Names were repeated, claims aligned, and the supposed German dissidents described internal rivalries, policy disputes, and growing opposition to Hitler. British officers believed these contacts demonstrated the existence of organized resistance within German intelligence circles. The information seemed consistent enough to justify further engagement, yet subtle inconsistencies surfaced beneath that coherence. Details offered by the contacts were accurate in tone, but vague in substance. Promised documents never appeared. Meetings produced summaries rather than evidence. Each explanation was reasonable. Taken together, they formed a pattern of deferral rather than delivery. Still, No clear breach of tradecraft could be identified. British investigators reviewed reports in London with care. Files were cross-checked against other intelligence sources. Some claims could not be independently verified. Others aligned conveniently with British expectations. The absence of contradiction was reassuring. It suggested reliability, not manipulation. This assumption would later prove costly. German counterintelligence deepened its own investigation in parallel. The Sicherheitsdienst used the Venlo meetings to identify senior figures within Britain's secret intelligence service. Their objective expanded from surveillance to capture. Knowing who to seize mattered more than disrupting a single meeting. Civilians near the border continued to observe quietly. The same vehicles appeared on similar days. Men waited rather than entered buildings. Conversations ended quickly. A local worker noticed how drivers kept engines running during meetings, prepared for rapid departure. And these details suggested planning, not chance. British officers considered security measures. Escape routes were discussed. Backup vehicles positioned, contingencies reviewed. None of these precautions addressed the central vulnerability, the authenticity of the contacts. Intelligence investigation focused outward, not inward. The assumption of good faith remained unchallenged. German planners exploited this blind spot. The SD deliberately avoided aggressive behavior to maintain British confidence and prolong access. They allowed the British to feel in control, knowing that control was an illusion. Each delay tightened the net. The investigation, on both sides, reached a critical asymmetry. British intelligence sought confirmation. German counterintelligence sought closure. One side waited for proof. The other was prepared for action. The difference lay not in skill, but in objective. By early November, conditions favored the trap. The British believed they were on the verge of a breakthrough, closer to identifying genuine opposition within Germany. The Germans believed they had identified key personnel worth capturing alive. The stage was set by mutual certainty, but only one side's certainty reflected reality. The clues had been present. They had been noticed, discussed, and dismissed. Intelligence work does not fail from ignorance alone. It fails when interpretation lags behind observation. At Venlo, investigation did not uncover the truth. It reinforced a belief that made discovery impossible until it was too late. As the planned meeting approached, the atmosphere along the border grew heavier, though nothing outwardly changed. A fog returned each evening, settling low over roads and fields, blurring distances and softening sound. Engines echoed longer than expected. Footsteps seemed closer than they were. The environment itself felt compressed, as if space were narrowing around those who moved through it. British officers sensed pressure without identifying its source. Procedures were reviewed again. Arrival times adjusted slightly. Vehicles checked and rechecked. Conversations turned practical and brief. The smell of damp coats and cold metal filled car interiors as doors closed quietly. No one spoke of aborting the meeting. To do so would suggest doubt, and doubt had not yet crystallized. German counterintelligence, by contrast, had entered the final phase. The Sicherheitsdienst authorized a direct action to seize British intelligence officers at the border near Venlo. Orders were precise. Timing mattered, speed mattered, surprise mattered most of all. Units were positioned just out of sight, rehearsing movements that would last only seconds. Local civilians sensed unusual tension. Patrols appeared slightly more alert. Vehicles paused longer at intersections. The sound of engines idling carried through the fog. A cafe owner noticed unfamiliar men who did not order anything, standing near the windows and watching the street. Nothing happened, yet the waiting itself felt deliberate. British intelligence underestimated the immediacy of danger. Meetings had always ended quietly. Neutral ground had always held. The border, though watched, had never been violated openly. The British officers believed German agents would not risk an overt operation on Dutch soil. That belief was reasonable and disastrously wrong. The Germans accepted the risk. They calculated that speed and confusion would outweigh diplomatic consequences. Their objective was not discretion, but capture. The operation relied on shock, not negotiation. Vehicles were positioned for rapid withdrawal. Weapons were loaded, but concealed. The plan allowed no delay. Inside British vehicles, tension manifested physically. Hands rested near door handles. Eyes checked mirrors repeatedly. Breathing slowed. The smell of cigarette smoke mixed with fog-damp air. These were familiar sensations, signs of caution, not fear. The officers believed they were managing risk effectively. The civilian observer near the border noticed the final convergence. The cars arrived from different directions within minutes of each other. Engines were not turned off. Doors remained closed. No one exited immediately. The stillness felt unnatural, as if movement were being held back deliberately. He did not intervene. Neutrality required distance. Time narrowed. Seconds began to matter more than hours. The meeting point, chosen for discretion, became a funnel. Visibility dropped further. Sound carried unpredictably. What had once felt controlled now felt brittle, one unexpected action away from collapse. Neither side spoke openly. One side expected conversation, the other expected compliance. The rising danger lay in this mismatch of expectation. British intelligence arrived prepared for dialogue. German counterintelligence arrived prepared for force. The trap was no longer theoretical. It was set, manned, or in waiting. All that remained was contact. When it came, it would not unfold gradually. It would arrive suddenly, violently, and without room for correction, ending Britain's confidence at Venlo in a matter of moments. The moment arrived without warning. 1 second, the roadside meeting point remained still, fog drifting slowly, engines idling softly, breath visible in the cold air. Next, the silence was shattered. Vehicles surged forward. Doors were flung open. Boots struck the ground with force and urgency. Commands were shouted in German, sharp and unmistakable. British officers barely had time to react. Weapons were drawn too late. Escape routes vanished instantly. On November 9, 1939, German Sicherheitsdienst operatives crossed into Dutch territory near Venlo and seized 2 British intelligence officers. And the operation unfolded in seconds, not minutes. Speed overwhelmed preparation. Shots were fired briefly, more to intimidate than to fight. A Dutch officer was wounded in the chaos. Engines roared as vehicles reversed direction, tires skidding on wet ground. Fog swallowed the scene almost as quickly as it had revealed it. Within moments, the captives were being driven back across the border into Germany. For nearby civilians, the violence felt unreal. Doors remained closed. Curtains stayed drawn. No one intervened. Neutrality offered no protection now, only distance. The smell of exhaust lingered where calm had existed moments before. Then even that faded, leaving only disturbed ground and silence. Inside German custody, the meaning of what had happened became clear. The captured men were senior officers of Britain's secret intelligence service. Their seizure provided German intelligence with something invaluable: confirmation, names, procedures, organizational insight, things months of surveillance alone could not guarantee. The British intelligence network on the continent felt the impact almost immediately. Meetings were cancelled, contacts vanished, communication channels went silent. The Venlo incident exposed British intelligence officers and compromised SIS operations across Europe. Trust evaporated. Fear replaced confidence. For German intelligence, the operation was a triumph. It validated months of deception and demonstrated the effectiveness of counter-espionage conducted patiently. The trap had worked not because of superior force, but because belief had been exploited until resistance felt unnecessary. The civilian observer near the border learned of the incident only indirectly. Rumors circulated briefly, then disappeared. Official silence followed. The road returned to normal use within days. Nothing marked what had happened there, yet the absence itself was telling. The climax at Venlo was not dramatic in scale, but it was devastating in effect. Britain had not merely lost 2 officers, it had lost secrecy, confidence, and momentum. The discovery came too late to prevent damage. It revealed not a single mistake, but a chain of assumptions that had hardened into certainty. In intelligence work, discovery often comes when correction is no longer possible. At Venlo, the truth emerged only after the trap had closed, swiftly, decisively, and without room for recovery. The illusion of control ended at the border, leaving consequences that would echo far beyond that fog-covered road. The significance of the Venlo incident became apparent almost immediately within intelligence circles, even if the public remained unaware. The capture of 2 senior SIS officers represented one of the most damaging counterintelligence blows suffered by Britain early in the war. It was not merely a tactical failure, but a structural one. German intelligence exploited the outcome with precision. Information obtained from the captured officers allowed the Sicherheitsdienst to identify British intelligence contacts and methods across occupied Europe. Networks that had taken years to build were suddenly exposed. Safe houses were abandoned. Agents disappeared, some fleeing, and others arrested before they could react. Within Britain, the shock forced a rapid reassessment. Files were reviewed under pressure. Names were removed from circulation. Communication procedures were rewritten. Meetings were canceled indefinitely. The quiet confidence that had marked early SIS operations on the continent evaporated, replaced by caution bordering on paralysis. The timing made the damage worse. The incident occurred just months after the outbreak of World War II, when British intelligence was still establishing its wartime networks. What was lost at Venlo could not be quickly replaced. Trust, once broken, required time and proof to rebuild. Luxuries wartime intelligence rarely possesses. For Nazi Germany, the outcome served propaganda and security alike. Hitler himself referenced the incident as proof of British duplicity and incompetence. The Venlo incident was later cited by Adolf Hitler as justification for aggressive action against the Netherlands. Intelligence failure became political leverage. The broader consequence was strategic hesitation. British intelligence curtailed aggressive continental operations, shifting focus inward and toward long-term rebuilding. This pause altered the balance of early intelligence exchange in Germany's favor, allowing the Reich greater freedom of movement in occupied territories during a critical phase of the war. Civilians near the border never received an explanation or acknowledgement. Life returned to routine. Cafes reopened. Roads carried traffic again. The fog lifted and fell as before. The violence of that night dissolved into rumor, and then silence. Neutral ground resumed its quiet function, concealing its role in a major intelligence defeat. Historically, Venlo demonstrated a dangerous truth. Intelligence failures rarely result from recklessness alone. They emerge from professionalism guided by incorrect assumptions. The British officers acted carefully, methodically, and in good faith. What they misjudged was belief in the authenticity of their contacts and the safety of neutral ground. The outcome reshaped British counterintelligence doctrine. It reinforced skepticism, centralized control, and stricter verification of sources. Venlo became a lesson taught quietly within services, not celebrated publicly, a warning preserved in files rather than memory. The incident did not end Britain's intelligence war, but it crippled it at a moment when resilience mattered most, proving that a single, well-executed trap could unravel years of work without ever firing more than a handful of shots. In the weeks following the Venlo incident, silence became policy. The British government deliberately limited public discussion of the incident. Newspapers carried no detailed accounts. Official statements were vague. The public never learned how close Britain's intelligence services had come to collapse in the war's opening phase. Inside Britain's intelligence community, the atmosphere changed permanently. Trust was no longer assumed. It had to be proven repeatedly. Meetings were centralized. Independent contacts were discouraged. After Venlo, the British intelligence adopted far stricter controls over agent handling and source verification. What had once relied on initiative now required authorization. The captured officers did not return. They disappeared into German prisons, their fate discussed only behind closed doors. Their absence left gaps that could not be openly acknowledged. Files bearing their names were quietly removed from circulation. Careers ended without ceremony. In intelligence work, failure rarely receives an epitaph. For German counterintelligence, Venlo became a model operation. The Sicherheitsdienst regarded the incident as a textbook success in counter-espionage deception. It demonstrated that patient manipulation could be more effective than brute force. German services would continue to favor deception-based traps in the years that followed. Civilians who had witnessed fragments of the incident never fully understood its meaning. They remembered only sudden noise, unusual movement, and an abrupt return to calm. No plaques marked the site. No records explained the disruption. The border resumed its ordinary function, erasing physical traces of what had occurred. Historically, Venlo's legacy lies less in what it destroyed than in what it forced to evolve. The disaster contributed indirectly to the creation of tighter British counterintelligence systems, including closer cooperation between MI5 and SIS. The painful lessons of Venlo shaped later successes by ensuring such assumptions would never again go unchallenged. In retrospect, the incident stands as a warning rather than an anomaly. It shows how intelligence services can be undone not by ignorance, but by confidence shaped through repetition. The British officers involved were competent, cautious, and experienced. They failed not because they ignored danger, but because they believed they understood it. Venlo rarely appears in popular histories of the war. There were no battles won or lost that day, no territory gained. Yet its consequences rippled outward, shaping intelligence conduct for years to come. It crippled Britain's spy network when secrecy mattered most, and proved that in espionage, belief is often the most dangerous vulnerability. The intelligence trap at Venlo succeeded because it looked ordinary: a meeting, a neutral town, familiar routines. And when it closed, it left behind no monument, only a lesson written quietly into the doctrine of modern intelligence, where it remains, largely unseen, but never forgotten.